If I lived in 1850 and I had to guess who the up-and-coming four new powers would be, I would guess Russia, China, the US, and Brazil. Russia, because it's just so huge and has such large manpower reserves and is the endless resources of Siberia to pull on. China, because it's the largest country in the world by population standards, and in the 1850s, it had interest in Western technology and was doing some modernization. The US, because it was expanding amazingly rapidly and it was industrializing and became a massive steel producer, and Brazil, because it was huge and had endless amounts of resources and could have space to expand. I never could have predicted the rise of Germany or Japan, but all my other predictions would have come true. So what did Brazil do wrong? It seems like Brazil's geography plays right into its hands. It's filled with endless lands for farmers to move into and expand. It's not surrounded by enemies, and all of its neighbors are much weaker and smaller countries. So what if Brazil was a superpower? That is the question of this alternate history. The main reason Brazil was never a superpower was because Brazil was never industrialized. This was because Brazil was mainly a slave economy, and slavery brought in so much money for Brazil, there was no need to industrialize, meaning Brazil never really industrialized. But the way Brazil could have industrialized is that they should have had a merchant class to outweigh the slave owners in industrialization. Generally, the merchants are the ones who want to industrialize, because it would bring in wealth, and the change would likely be for the better for their own pockets. And so, if Brazil had a large merchant class, they would likely industrialize. The best way to view 19th century Brazil is to view it as what if the US never had the northern states. In the US, the northern states acted like the industrializers and they traded with Europe, being the middlemen for the cotton that went from the south to Europe. But in Brazil, this never happened, and having a merchant class in Brazil would act in a role similarly to the North did in the US, in our timeline. As Brazil would be the largest and most powerful nation in South America, that would mean that most of the other surrounding nations would likely become either Brazilian protectorates or allies. As the US would seize Panama to build the Panama Canal in the late 19th century, this would bring the US into war with Colombia like it did in our timeline. The major shift would be that Colombia would be a Brazilian protectorate, and so if the US declared war on Colombia, it would mean that the US would also declare war on Brazil. And so a war would commence with Panama as its flashpoint. As the jungles of Panama are too thick to actually march an army through, there would actually be no land fighting in this war, and both powers would just batter each other on the seas outside the Caribbean. But in the end, there wouldn't be any land changes, and the only effect of this war would be that it would make both powers hate each other and felt they had been cheated out of a true victory. Having another major power in America's backyard would mean that America could no longer be isolationist in this timeline. And as America has cultural connections to England, we can assume that America would join the Allies. Meanwhile, Brazil would want to be on any side the Americans weren't on, and so it would join the Central Powers. Argentina, being very close to Brazil, would be one of those countries that would fall under the Brazilian sway and become a Brazilian protectorate. But Chile, wanting to be on any side Argentina wouldn't be on, would join the Americans and become part of the Allies. The Brazilians would invade the British and French Guianas and be victorious. The Brazilians and Argentinians would also invade Chile. Around Chile, the war would quickly dissolve into trench warfare. This is because in World War I, the technology was biased towards the defender, meaning that the Chileans could fortify a few mountain passes in between Argentina and Chile and hold back the Argentinians and Brazilians with trench warfare, and it would work. Also, the US could send supplies to Chile with its Pacific fleet. And the Brazilians don't have a Pacific coast, so they wouldn't have a Pacific fleet. The Brazilians would also likely strike at the Congo, because doing so would destroy the Allied rubber supply. But this would fail because there weren't any roads going through the Congo. The Brazilians could seize a few coastal cities, but beyond that, they couldn't penetrate deep into the Congo or into Allied Africa. Both sides likely sided with a side in the Mexican Civil War to gain influence over Mexico. The U.S. would side with the Democrats because the U.S. sided with the Democrats in our timeline, while meanwhile the Brazilians would side with the other side, the Royalists. In the end, the Democrats would likely win because the U.S. is a lot closer to Mexico than Brazil, and so the U.S. could send more supplies to their faction, and thus the Democrats would win. Besides this, both factions would batter each other navally in the Caribbean. This would mean that America, instead of pretending to be isolationist, would start the war in 1914 instead of 1917. Having America involved from the beginning on the Western Front would mean that the Allies could use America's massive resources to their advantage for the whole war, and so the Germans would have to use all of their resources to hold the Western Front, and so they wouldn't have any resources to fight on the Eastern Front, and in the end, World War I would be won much earlier for the Allies. Brazil, having picked the wrong side but never actually have been defeated, would mean that it would be given an honorable treaty in which it would be forced back to its pre-war borders, but wouldn't have to pay any reparations or anything like that. The Germans never having the troops or the energy to invade Russia would mean that the Russians would never be utterly humiliated by the Germans, and so the Russian Civil War would never have happened, and communism would never have arisen in Russia as a side effect of Russia losing World War I, meaning Russia would never be communist. Russia not being communist in this timeline would mean that the Russians wouldn't fund communist movements in other nations such as China or Cuba, meaning that those nations never would have become communist in this timeline. As the Germans would have never gotten close to winning the war in this timeline, with all the extra American troops on the front line, the stab-in-the-back theory would never have evolved in Germany, and so Hitler never would have risen to power. As Hitler would never have risen to power, we can assume instead the militarists would have taken over Germany, as they had previously before World War I, and in other places such as Japan. As Germany never would have felt it was betrayed and inches from victory, that would mean World War II would not start in Europe in this timeline. Instead, it would start in the Pacific, with the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor, and it would start with a war between Japan and the US. With the Americans busy fighting the Japanese, the Germans and the Brazilians would think this would be a perfect time to strike back, and they would declare war, and World War II would begin. A shorter World War I would mean that the French would never have lost their obsession with offensive tactics, meaning when World War II would roll along, the French would have been able to adapt to tank tactics, meaning in this timeline the Germans would have been unable to conquer France. As the Tsars would have survived, the Russians would have obligated their treaty with France, meaning that when Germany would have declared war on France, that the Russians would have joined and fought against the Germans from 1939 onward instead of 1940. Also, without Stalin, that would mean that there would have been no officer purges, and the Russian army would have been much more experienced in this timeline. These two things added together would mean that World War II would end much faster in Europe. Because in World War II, the offense had the advantage instead of the defense, unlike World War I, the Brazilians could easily conquer Chile and the Guyanas. The U.S. Navy would be fighting a three-front war, meaning that it would be spread thin, and so the Brazilians could punch through the U.S. Navy line in the Caribbean and invade the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola and Cuba to get a springboard to attack the U.S., and the U.S. would know this, and so vicious fighting would take place in Cuba and Hispaniola. I don't know who would win the battle for Cuba and Hispaniola, but if the Brazilians won the battle, that would mean they could use Cuba as a launching platform to strike at the Gulf states of the U.S. But they'd be unlikely to win this battle because their supply lines would be thin at this point, and the US is just such a huge country with such a large industry. Even if they were to win the battle for Cuba, Hispaniola, and the Gulf states, it wouldn't mean anything, because the Americans would discover the atom bomb, and that would make them the winners of the war against the Brazilians and the Japanese. The world wars being shorter would mean that Europe wouldn't come out of the world wars exhausted and bankrupt, meaning that Europe would never have decolonized its colonial empires in this timeline. This would mean that Europe would still be one of the most powerful regions in the world into the 21st century. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this timeline, please comment or subscribe. Whatifalthist. Thank you for watching.